Nora's fingers trembled as the torchlight carved her face into uneven shadows, revealing the outline of lips that refused to plead. The narrow corridor smelled of damp stone and ancient secrets, and the soldiers pushed her as if she were already dead. She felt the sepulchre's chill even before seeing it, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to answer the erratic rhythm of her own heart. And then, the runes began to glow. Before we delve into her story, leave a comment below with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Nora had never known a life beyond the one imposed upon her from her very first breath. Born in the underbelly of the Archon's citadel, she had grown up amidst shadows and silence, learning early on that her existence was a flaw the world tolerated purely out of convenience. Defective Omega, they called her in the narrow halls where the handmaidens whispered as they passed. It was how the soldiers looked at her when they needed someone for tasks no one else would accept. Her inner wolf had never awakened, and, in the rigid hierarchy of the realm, this meant she held no value beyond her ultimate utility. The morning her fate was sealed began like any other. Nora awoke in the damp little room she shared with 3 other handmaidens, her body aching from the too-thin mattress, her eyes heavy from a night of sleep interrupted by nightmares she couldn't explain. She had dreamed of glowing runes, of a deep voice calling her name from somewhere far away, of hands that held her not to harm her, but to protect her from something she couldn't see. Councilwoman Mildred appeared before breakfast. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of every person she met. Nora knew her by sight, aware that she was one of the most powerful figures on the Archon Council, but had never exchanged a single word with her. So, when Mildred stopped before her door and pronounced her name with icy precision, Nora felt her stomach drop. "You have been chosen," the councilwoman said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like satisfaction, disguised as formality. "The sepulchre ritual will take place at sunset." The other handmaidens instinctively recoiled, as if Nora's proximity could contaminate them with her fate. She knew the story, of course. Everyone did. The ancient sepulchre that held the last Alpha King, imprisoned 1,000 years ago by the Archon's ancestors, demanded a periodic tribute. Defective Omegas were sent to touch the seal, and none had ever returned. Some said they died the instant of the touch, consumed by an energy too ancient for such fragile bodies. Others whispered that the king himself devoured them, sustaining himself through their sacrifices. Nora didn't know which version to believe. Perhaps it didn't matter. The result was the same. The hours that followed passed in a blur of preparations she barely registered. They bathed her in water perfumed with herbs, supposedly meant to purify her body for the ritual. They dressed her in a simple, unadorned white tunic, the fabric too thin to protect her from the cold that awaited her in the underground. They bound her brown hair into a braid that fell down her back like a silk rope. And throughout the entire process, no one looked her in the eyes. It was as if she had already ceased to exist. When the soldiers came to fetch her, the sun was already setting beyond the citadel walls, painting the sky in orange hues that seemed to mock the darkness that awaited her. Nora walked among them with steady steps, refusing to show the fear that squeezed her chest. If she was going to die, she would die with her head held high. It was the only thing she could still control. The path to the sepulchre chamber was long and winding, descending through stone staircases that seemed endless. As they advanced, the air grew, denser, colder, laden with a humidity that clung to her skin like icy sweat. The walls displayed symbols Nora didn't recognize, grooves and marks that told stories in a long-forgotten language. Spaced torches lit the way with a flickering light that made the shadows dance like restless spectres. And then, something strange happened. As they approached the final chamber, Nora began to feel a pulsation deep in her chest, a rhythm that wasn't hers, a deep, resonant beat that seemed to respond to something beyond the stone walls. The runes carved into the stones began to glow with an almost imperceptible bluish hue, and the soldiers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances that she caught out of the corner of her eye. "Keep walking," the captain ordered, but his voice betrayed an uncertainty that didn't match his rigid posture. The sepulchre chamber was larger than Nora had imagined. The ceiling rose into an impressive vault, supported by columns that displayed more luminescent symbols. In the centre, elevated on a pedestal of black marble, lay the seal, a circular plate of unknown material that glowed with its own light. The air around it vibrated with an almost palpable energy, and Nora felt the hairs on her arms, stand on end in response. Councilwoman Mildred awaited with a group of nobles dressed in ceremonial robes, their faces partially hidden by embroidered hoods. Nora recognized some of them from the rare occasions she had served in the upper halls. They were high-ranking members of the Archons, people who would never look at a handmaiden like her under normal circumstances. "The offering has arrived," Mildred announced, and there was a note of anticipation in her voice that made Nora shiver. "Let the ritual begin." The soldiers pushed her forward and she stumbled in her first steps, before regaining her balance. The seal pulsed before her, and the closer she got, the more intense the strange rhythm in her chest became. It was as if something within her was awakening, something that had slept her entire life and now recognized the call. "Touch the seal," Mildred ordered, "and may your sacrifice maintain the balance of the realm." Nora raised her hand, her fingers trembling despite her determination to appear strong. The surface of the seal was strangely warm to the touch, vibrating beneath her palm like a gigantic heart. And then, before she could process what was happening, the runes exploded in light. The glare was too intense to look at directly, and Nora closed her eyes by instinct as a wave of energy coursed through her body like an electric current. She heard screams in the distance, voices of soldiers and nobles retreating in panic, but everything seemed distant, muffled by a hum that dominated her ears. Something was moving inside the sepulchre, something ancient and powerful that responded not to the ritual, but to her specifically. When the light finally subsided and Nora could open her eyes, the seal had vanished. In its place, our opening revealed itself in the marble pedestal, and from within it, a figure slowly emerged. It was a man, or at least had the form of one, but there was something about him that transcended anything human. Tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair that fell over a face of sharp features and golden eyes that gleamed with a supernatural intensity. Scars marked his exposed skin, vestiges of ancient battles, but his body radiated a strength that seemed to defy time itself. The Alpha King had awakened, and his gaze was fixed on Nora. "You," he said, and his voice was deep, like distant thunder laden with 1,000 years of silence. Finally. Nora couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She felt the weight of that gaze like something physical, a force that held her in place while the world around them erupted into chaos. The nobles shouted contradictory orders, the soldiers drew weapons that trembled in their hands, and Mildred recoiled with an expression that mingled terror and fury. But the Alpha didn't look at any of them. He looked only at her. And in that instant, Nora knew that her life would never be the same. The Alpha took a step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath his weight. It wasn't just physical strength, it was presence, an aura of dominance that made the air thicken around him. Nora felt her legs weaken, but something kept her standing, a force she didn't recognize as her own. 1,000 years, the Alpha murmured, and there was something in his voice that was not just anger or thirst for vengeance, it was recognition. "I waited 1,000 years for you." The words made no sense. How could he know her? How could he have waited for someone who was born centuries after his imprisonment? But before Nora could formulate any question, chaos exploded around them. Mildred screamed an order, and the soldiers advanced with raised spears, but the Alpha didn't even deign to look at them. With a fluid, almost lazy movement, he extended his hand, and a wave of energy swept through the chamber, throwing the attackers against the walls like leaves in the wind. No one died, Nora realized with a start of relief, but all lay unconscious on the stone floor. Only she and he remained, face to face in the chamber that had been his prison for a millennium. "Don't be afraid," the Alpha said, and his voice was almost gentle now, a disturbing contrast to the violence he had just demonstrated. "I would never harm you." And for some reason she couldn't explain, Nora believed him. The chamber around them still echoed with the sounds of the awakening. The nobles remained unconscious against the walls, their ceremonial robes dusty and dishevelled, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Councilwoman Mildred was slumped not far from them, her grey bun undone, a trickle of blood running from a cut on her forehead. Nora observed everything with a strange detachment, as if she were watching a scene unfold for someone else. Minutes ago, she was a condemned handmaiden, walking to her death with the resignation of one who had never known another option. Now she stood beside a creature of legends, a king who should have been dead 1,000 years ago, and the entire world seemed to have turned upside down. Caleb, for that was the name he had murmured earlier, the name she instinctively knew belonged to him, moved through the chamber with a disturbing familiarity. His steps were silent despite his imposing size, and there was a predatory grace in every movement that stirred something within Nora. He stopped before one of the walls and touched a specific symbol among the many carved into the stone. A section of the wall slid aside, revealing a dark passage that disappeared into the citadel's depths. "Come," he said, extending his hand to her. "We don't have much time before they wake up." Nora hesitated only for an instant before accepting his hand. The contact sent a wave of warmth through her arm, a sensation that wasn't unpleasant, just unexpected. His fingers were firm and warm, and when they closed around hers, she felt a security she had never experienced before. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they entered the passage. "You don't know me." Caleb looked at her over his shoulder, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness like lanterns. "I have known you for 1,000 years," he said, "even if you don't know it yet." The enigmatic words echoed in Nora's mind as she followed in silence. The corridor was narrow and damp, illuminated by runes that lit up as they passed, and then faded. The air carried a scent of ancient earth and buried secrets, and with every step she took, Nora felt as if she were moving away not just from the citadel, but from everything she had known until then. Questions piled up in her mind like dammed water, threatening to overflow, but she forced herself to remain silent. There would be time for answers later. Now what mattered was survival. The passage descended for a long time before finally beginning to ascend again. Nora lost track of how long they walked, her feet protesting in thin shoes that were never made for such a journey. But each time she thought of asking to rest, something pushed her forward, an urgency she couldn't explain. When they finally emerged into the open air, night had already covered the world with its blanket of stars. They were somewhere outside the citadel walls, in a forest Nora only knew from distant glimpses through the windows of the kitchens where she worked. "Rest a moment," Caleb said, releasing her hand. "I need to check if we were followed." Nora nodded, unable to form words. Her legs gave out beneath her and she let herself fall onto the leaf-covered ground, her breath ragged, her heart still pounding with adrenaline. From somewhere in the shadows she heard Caleb moving, his alpha senses scanning the darkness for threats. And as she waited, the reality of what had just happened finally hit her with full force. She had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, she was alive. And not just alive, but free for the first time in her existence. The tears came then, silent and inevitable, running down her face as she hugged her knees and tried to process the storm of emotions that threatened to consume her. When Caleb returned, she was still crying. He said nothing, just sat beside her and waited, his presence a silent anchor amidst the internal chaos she faced. And in that instant, Nora knew that her life would never be the same. The silence that followed the destruction was more deafening than the chaos itself. Nora remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the man who had emerged from the sepulchre as if time had not passed, as if 1,000 years were merely an interrupted nap. He watched her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with her status as a handmaiden or her supposed weakness as an Omega. The Alpha then moved, approaching her with measured steps, and Nora found she couldn't retreat. Not because she was paralyzed with fear, but because something within her refused to flee. It was as if a part of her being, a part she hadn't known until that moment, recognized this man and accepted him without question. "What is your name?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. His voice was low now, almost intimate, stripped of the thundering authority from before. "Nora," she replied, and her own voice sounded strange too, her ears firmer than she expected. "My name is Nora." The Alpha tilted his head slightly as if savouring the sound. "Nora," he repeated. "A strong name, fitting." She didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever described anything about her as fitting or strong. She was the defective one, the failure, the one born wrong. But his gaze contained neither pity nor contempt. It contained something she couldn't name. "We need to get out of here," the Alpha said, turning his attention to the unconscious bodies scattered throughout the chamber. "When they wake, they will summon reinforcements. The Council will not let my liberation go unpunished." "And where will we go?" Nora heard herself ask, as if the decision to accompany him had already been made, without her conscious participation. He looked at her again, and there was a flicker of something that could be surprise in his golden eyes. "You're coming with me?" "Do I have a choice?" The question hung in the air between them. Nora knew the answer, of course. She could stay, face the Archon's fury for having survived the ritual, be interrogated, tortured perhaps, until they extracted some explanation for the inexplicable. Or she could follow this stranger who, for reasons she still didn't understand, seemed to be the only person in her entire existence who looked at her as if she had value. "There is always a choice," the Alpha finally replied, "but some choices are more costly than others. If you stay, they will destroy you trying to understand why the seal reacted to you. If you come with me, you will face dangers I cannot fully foresee, but you will be alive, and you will be free." Freedom. The word echoed in Nora's mind like a distant bell. It was a concept she had always considered abstract, something that belonged to others, never to someone like her. "I'll go with you," she said, and the decision brought with it a strange sense of peace. The Alpha nodded once as if he expected no different answer. "Then we need to move now." Their escape from the Citadel proved easier than Nora had imagined. The Alpha knew passages that existed on no map, secret corridors carved into the rock that snaked beneath the fortress's foundations. He moved with absolute confidence, even after 1,000 years of absence, as if the structure of the place was permanently etched in his memory. "These passages were built by my lineage," he explained as they advanced in the darkness, the only light coming from a luminescent orb he had conjured with a casual wave of his hand. Before the Archons, before the Council, this land was governed differently. There was balance between the castes, mutual respect between Alphas, Betas, and Omegas. "What happened?" Nora asked, curious despite the fear that still tightened her chest. The Alpha fell silent for a moment, his steps echoing on the damp stones. "Betrayal," he finally said. Those who were supposed to protect the balance decided that power should belong only to them. The Archons are not descendants of legitimate warriors or leaders. They are heirs of conspirators who assassinated and erased an entire era of history. His words contradicted everything Nora had learned since childhood. Official history painted the Archons as saviors, nobles who had liberated the realm from the tyranny of a mad Alpha King. But looking at the man beside her, she saw no madness. She saw weariness, yes, and an ancient sorrow that seemed deeper than any rage. "And me?" she asked, the question escaping before she could contain it. "Why did the seal react to me? Why did you say you waited for me?" The Alpha stopped walking, turning to face her in the tunnel's gloom. The orb's light cast strange shadows on his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his features. "You don't know," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Of course you don't know. They erased everything." "What? What did they erase?" He extended his hand and, with a gentleness that contrasted with his intimidating appearance, touched her face. Nora felt warmth course through her skin at the point of contact, a sensation that spread throughout her body like ripples in still water. "You carry in your blood the lineage of the Guardians," he said, "the family that, 1,000 years ago, was responsible for selecting and legitimizing the realm's rulers. They were the ones who created the seal that imprisoned me, and they were the first to be eliminated when the Archons seized power. Or so they thought." Nora shook her head, unable to process the information. "That's impossible. I'm a defective Omega. I have no wolf, no power, nothing." "You have everything," the Alpha corrected. "You were just taught not to see. The seal didn't react to you by chance. It was designed to recognize the blood of the Guardians, to open only when one of them approached. The fact that you are alive, that you have survived until now hidden among the handmaidens, is a miracle even I cannot fully explain." "But how?" "My mother was a common handmaiden. She died in childbirth. There was nothing special about her." "There was," the Alpha said, and his voice carried an unshakable certainty. "Either she was a guardian in disguise, or she descended from a line that managed to hide for generations. Either way, blood doesn't lie, Nora, and the seal recognized you." She felt her legs weaken and leaned against the tunnel wall, the cold stone against her back offering a welcome contrast to the warmth that still coursed through her body. It was all too much. In a single night, she had gone from a handmaiden condemned to death to a supposed heir of a forgotten lineage. It made no sense. "I know it's a lot to absorb," the Alpha said, and there was understanding in his voice. "But we'll have time for explanations later. Now, we need to get as far away as possible before dawn." Nora nodded, forcing herself to put one foot in front of the other as he resumed walking. Her legs protested, her whole body screamed for rest, but something propelled her forward. Perhaps it was fear of pursuers. Perhaps it was curiosity about her own past. Or perhaps it was simply the presence of the man beside her, a gravitational force that drew her in ways she didn't yet understand. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, the night sky greeted them with a blanket of stars that Nora rarely had the opportunity to contemplate. They were in a dense forest, far from the citadel walls, and the fresh night air filled her lungs like a promise of freedom. "We'll find shelter before dawn," the Alpha said, his golden eyes scanning the surrounding darkness with superhuman acuity. "I know a place not far from here. An old watcher post that must have been abandoned for centuries." Nora followed him in silence, her thoughts a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Who was she really? What did it mean to be a guardian? And why, despite all logic screaming that she should be terrified, did the presence of this unknown Alpha make her feel safer than she had ever felt in her entire life? The answers would have to wait. For now, all that mattered was surviving until dawn. The forest was dense and ancient, with trees whose trunks were so wide it would take several men to embrace them. Nora had never been to a place like this. Her entire life had been confined within stone walls, narrow corridors, windowless rooms. The open sky above her, even in the darkness of night, seemed infinite in a way that was both liberating and terrifying. The Alpha moved through the woods with impressive familiarity, weaving around exposed roots and low branches as if he could see perfectly in the dark. And perhaps he could, Nora realized. There was so much about him she still didn't understand. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. He slowed his pace, allowing her to catch up. "Caleb," he said. "My name is Caleb." Caleb. The name echoed in her mind, familiar somehow, as if she had heard it in long-forgotten dreams. "Caleb," she repeated, testing the sound on her lips. "It's a beautiful name." He looked at her out of the corner of his eye, and Nora could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile on his severe lips. "I don't think anyone has ever called it beautiful before. But thank you." They continued in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, lighter, somehow, as if that small exchange had built a bridge between two strangers who, by force of fate, now walked together towards the unknown. The forest around them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, sounds and movements Nora had never had the chance to experience before. Birds sang in the treetops, insects buzzed in intricate melodies, and now and then the rustling of leaves indicated the passage of some smaller creature fleeing their approach. "It's beautiful," she said, the words escaping before she could contain them. "I've never seen anything like it." Caleb slowed his pace to walk beside her, his eyes scanning the surrounding vegetation with an expression that mingled nostalgia and sorrow. "1,000 years ago, forests like this covered most of the realm," he said. "The Archons destroyed much in the name of progress. This patch survived only because it was considered too remote to be worth the effort." Nora absorbed the information in silence. It was yet another reminder of how much she didn't know about the real world, about the true history of her people. Her entire education, if it could even be called that, had consisted of learning to serve, to become invisible, to accept her place at the bottom of the hierarchy without question. "You'll tell me everything, won't you?" she asked. "About the past, about the Guardians, about who I really am." Caleb nodded. "When we reach a safe place. There's much to explain, and some things will be difficult to hear. But you deserve the truth, Nora. All of it." The promise ignited a flame of determination in her chest. No matter how difficult the truth, she was ready to face it. After a lifetime of lies and half-truths, the prospect of finally knowing her own story was both frightening and liberating. The sun was setting when they finally reached the clearing where Caleb intended to camp. It was a small space surrounded by ancient trees whose thick trunks offered some visual protection from the outside. A stream ran, not far away, the sound of the water creating a gentle melody that calmed Nora's nerves. "Rest," Caleb said, indicating a soft spot covered with leaves. "I'll get water and check the surroundings." Nora obeyed, her legs grateful for the respite. She watched as he disappeared among the trees, his movements silent like those of a natural predator. It was strange to trust someone she had known for so short a time so completely, but something in her, perhaps the guardian blood running in her veins, insisted that he was worthy of that trust. When he returned carrying water in, a container he had conjured from who knew where, Nora realized that darkness had already enveloped the forest. Only the starlight filtered through the treetops, creating a carpet of silvery dots on the ground around them. "Tomorrow we'll reach the hills," Caleb said, sitting a respectful distance from her. "The terrain will be more difficult, but also easier to defend if we're attacked." "Do you think we'll be attacked?" Nora asked, anxiety returning to squeeze her chest. "It's likely. The Archons won't give up easily. but they'll have difficulty tracking us here. This forest is ancient and holds many secrets. Some of those secrets work in our favor." The enigmatic words hung in the air, and Nora decided not to press for explanations. There was time for more questions later. For now, all she wanted was to close her eyes and forget, even for a few hours, the madness her life had become. The shelter Caleb had mentioned turned out to be a stone structure partially swallowed by vegetation, its walls covered in moss and vines that concealed carved symbols similar to those in the sepulchre chamber. Nora watched as he pulled back a curtain of plants, revealing a narrow entrance, almost invisible to inattentive eyes. "This place belonged to the Watchers," Caleb explained as he guided her inside. "Men and women designated to guard the realm's borders. They were the first to fall when the Archons seized power." The interior was surprisingly well preserved, protected by solid rock and oblivion. There was a stone fireplace in one corner, dusty shelves that still held ceramic pots, and a cot covered in furs that, despite the centuries, seemed intact. "How is this possible?" Nora asked, touching one of the furs with hesitant fingers. The material was soft beneath her touch, with no sign of deterioration. "Ancient preservation," Caleb replied, kneeling before the fireplace and beginning to arrange kindling that was piled beside it. "A technique the Archons lost, or, more likely, destroyed, along with all knowledge that didn't serve their purposes. The ancient families knew how to protect what was important." With a flick of his hand, a spark of light leaped from his fingers and ignited the kindling. The fire grew rapidly, filling the space with a welcome warmth that Nora hadn't even realized she needed. Only then did she notice how much she was trembling, not just from cold, but from exhaustion. "Rest," Caleb said, indicating the cot with a nod. "You'll need your strength for what's to come." "And you?" she asked, without moving. "Alphas don't need as much rest as others, and after 1,000 years of sleep, I confess, I prefer to stay awake for a while." There was a dark tone in his words that made Nora hesitate. She tried to imagine what it would be like to spend a millennium trapped in a sepulchre, conscious or unconscious, knowing that the world moved on without you while your enemies built a realm on the ashes of everything you loved. The image was too horrific to contemplate for long. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words escaping before she could contain them. "For what they did to you." Caleb looked at her, and there was something in his golden eyes she couldn't quite decipher. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude for a gesture of compassion he probably didn't expect. "You are curious, Nora of the Guardians," he finally said. "You apologize for what others did when you should be furious for what they did to you. To me? You were raised as a handmaiden, scorned and humiliated for something that wasn't a flaw, but a protection. Your wolf didn't awaken because it was put to sleep, not because it doesn't exist. The Archons did this to all children who carried potentially dangerous blood. It was easier than killing them." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. All the scorn she had suffered, all the humiliations, the look of disgust on the faces of those who called her defective, all of it based on a deliberate lie. It wasn't a genetic flaw. It was sabotage. "Why didn't they kill me then?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "If I was a threat, why keep me alive?" "Because they didn't know exactly what you were," Caleb replied. "The Guardian's blood is rare and difficult to identify. They probably thought you were just another common Omega with a weak wolf. The sleeping procedure is applied to dozens of children each generation as a precaution. You went unnoticed. Until now." "Until now," he confirmed. "And when the seal reacted to you, everything changed. Now they know what you are, and they won't stop until they find you." A chill ran down Nora's spine. The idea of being hunted by the Archons, by the entire military force of the Citadel was terrifying. She had no skills, no training, nothing but the company of an alpha who, however powerful, was weakened by a millennium of imprisonment. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb said, "You are safer with me than you imagine. And there are others who can help us if we can reach them." Others? Who? Descendants of the ancient families hidden in distant communities. Not all were eliminated. Some learned to hide so well that the Archons gave up searching for them. There's a village in the northern mountains where we can find refuge and, hopefully, answers. Nora absorbed the information in silence. A part of her simply wanted to disappear, to find some place where she could live in peace, forgotten by everyone. But another part, a part that grew with each passing moment, wanted to know the truth. She wanted to understand who her ancestors were, why her blood was so important, and what the Archons were so determined to conceal. "I'll rest," she finally said, walking toward the cot. "But tomorrow I want you to tell me everything. The true story, not the version they taught us." Caleb nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made them look like liquid flames. "You will have your answers, Nora. All of them. But be prepared, because some truths are harder to bear than lies." She lay down on the furs, surprised by the comfort they offered. Exhaustion was a weight in her bones, but her mind refused to quiet. She lay watching the stone ceiling as the fire danced shadows around her, wondering how a single night could so completely change the trajectory of a life. At some point, sleep overtook her, but it wasn't peaceful. Dreams came in confused waves, images of glowing runes, of golden eyes watching her in the darkness, of voices calling her name in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. And beneath it all, a persistent feeling that something within her was awakening, slowly, like a flower opening to the sun after a long winter. When she awoke, the morning light filtered through cracks in the stone walls, and the fire had reduced to smouldering embers. Caleb was exactly where she had left him, sitting by the fireplace with his eyes closed, but she knew instinctively that he wasn't sleeping. He was in some kind of meditation, perhaps recovering strength in a way only alphas understood. Nora rose silently, not wanting to disturb him, and walked to one of the cracks to observe the outside. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds singing, leaves whispering in the wind, and for a moment she almost managed to forget the gravity of her situation. "Did you sleep well?" Caleb's voice came from behind her, and Nora turned to find him standing, watching her with that intense gaze she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic. "I had strange dreams," she admitted. "But rested, yes." He nodded. "Dreams are common when the wolf begins to awaken. They will probably increase in intensity in the coming days." "My wolf is awakening?" The question came out, laden with hope and fear in equal measure. "Ever since you touched the seal, the sleeping process began to reverse. It's slow but inevitable now. You will feel changes, some subtle, others more intense. Your perception will sharpen, your senses will broaden, and eventually—" He didn't complete the sentence, but Nora understood. Eventually she would become complete. She would cease to be the defective one, the failure, the despised handmaiden. She would become what she was always meant to be. The prospect was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. "We need to leave," Caleb said, interrupting her thoughts. "The Archons must have already sent out scouts, and the further we get from the citadel, the harder it will be to track us." Nora agreed with a nod, setting aside her reflections to focus on the present. There was a long journey ahead, and she would need all her strength to face it. They left the shelter shortly after, the morning sun warming their backs as they ventured deeper into the ancient forest. Caleb led the way, his alpha senses alert to any sign of danger, and Nora followed him in silence, trying to process everything she had learned in the past few hours. She was a guardian. Her blood carried a legacy the Archons had tried to erase. And alongside the Alpha King, who should have died 1,000 years ago, she was about to discover truths that could change the fate of an entire realm. The journey to the northern mountains had only just begun. As they walked, Nora couldn't help but notice how Caleb moved with an almost supernatural grace, each step calculated, each movement economical and precise. There was a wild beauty in him that made her look away every time she realized she was staring for too long. "You're watching me," he said without turning, and Nora felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Sorry. It's just, I've never seen a real alpha before. The few who serve the Archons are different. More domesticated, I guess." Caleb let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it was tinged with bitterness. Domesticated is a gentle word for what they did to them. Broken would be more accurate. Nora swallowed, hard. There was so much she didn't know about the real world, so much that had been hidden from her behind the citadel walls. And now, walking through the forest beside a fallen king, she began to realize how profound her ignorance was. "Will you teach me?" she asked impulsively, "about what it means to be what I am?" Caleb finally turned to look at her, and there was something on his face Nora didn't expect to see. Something that resembled tenderness. "I will teach you everything I know," he said, "and together we will discover what even I don't know. Because something tells me, Nora of the Guardians, that your destiny is greater than any of us can imagine." His words hung in the air as they continued their journey. Nora allowed herself to get lost in thought, trying to process everything she had learned in the past few hours. It was as if her entire life had been a puzzle with missing pieces, and now, one by one, those pieces were beginning to appear. The terrain gradually changed as they advanced. The dense forest gave way to sparser vegetation, with open clearings that offered panoramic views of the Shiu, rolling hills around them. The air was fresher here, carrying a scent of wildflowers Nora didn't recognize, but found inexplicably comforting. "We're approaching the border between territories," Caleb explained. "From here on, the Archon's influence is weaker. Communities are more autonomous, less controlled." "Is that good?" Nora asked. "It depends. It means we'll have fewer direct pursuers, but also less protection if we're attacked. Border villages are known for their neutrality, but that neutrality can mean they'll hand us over to the Archons if the price is high enough." It was a grim reminder that they were still far from safety. Nora felt a tightening in her chest, but forced herself to maintain her composure. She had come this far, survived the impossible. She couldn't allow fear to paralyze her now. "What happened to you?" she asked, changing the subject. "I mean, what really happened? The story they tell us says you went mad, that you tried to destroy the realm, and that the Archons imprisoned you to protect the people." Caleb stopped walking, his back visibly stiffening. For a long moment he said nothing, and Nora feared she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. But then he turned, to face her, and there was a pain in his eyes that transcended centuries. "I govern this realm with justice," he said, his voice low but firm. "Or at least I tried. There was balance between the castes, cooperation among the families, a system that, though imperfect, worked for most. But some wanted more. Some believed power should be absolute, concentrated in the hands of a few." He paused, his eyes lost in some distant point in the past. "The Archons were advisors then, not rulers. They served the throne, not the other way around. But they conspired in the shadows, manipulated events, planted seeds of discord among the families. And when the time came, when the realm was weak enough from their machinations, they attacked." Nora listened in silence, her heart heavy with the tragedy unfolding before her through his words. "The Guardians were the first to fall," Caleb continued, "because they knew. They saw through the lies. They could identify the betrayal before it materialized. Eliminating them was essential to the Archon's plan. And then, when there was no one left to support me, they came for me." "And you didn't fight?" The question escaped before Nora could contain it. "I fought," Caleb said, and there was an indescribable weight in his voice. "I fought until the last moment. But they had the seal. a weapon the Guardians themselves had created as a last resort. They turned it against me with the help of someone I trusted. The betrayal was evident in every word, a wound that 1,000 years had not healed. "I'm sorry," Nora said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. Caleb looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that resembled gratitude. "The story they tell is a lie," he said. "But lies told long enough become truth in people's minds. That's why we need to reach Haven. There, the truths have been preserved. There we can begin to dismantle the narrative the Archons built." Nora nodded, a new determination forming in her chest. It wasn't just her own story that needed to be rewritten. It was the history of an entire realm, of generations who had lived under lies without even knowing it. "Then let's go," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. "The sooner we get there, the better." Caleb looked at her with something that could be pride and resumed walking without further words. But the silence between them now was different. It was the silence of two people who shared a purpose, a mission that went beyond mere survival. The journey to Haven was more than an escape. It was the first step of a revolution. The days that followed blurred into a routine of exhausting hikes and improvised camps. Caleb guided Nora along trails that seemed not to exist until he revealed them, hidden paths beneath dense foliage and across streams that erased any trace of their passage. Each night, when they stopped to rest, he shared fragments of the realm's true history, and each revelation was like a piece of a gigantic puzzle beginning to form in Nora's mind. She learned that the Guardians were not just a family, but an entire order, a group of individuals selected for specific genetic characteristics that allowed them to interact with ancient technologies that others couldn't even touch. They were the ones who maintained the balance of power among the castes, who chose who would govern and ensured that no single group completely dominated the others. But how could such a powerful order be destroyed? Nora asked one of those nights, sitting before the fire while Caleb kept watch in the shadows. "Trust," he replied, and the word carried the weight of ancient pain. The Guardians trusted too much those they swore to protect. When betrayal came, it was from within, from people who knew all the secrets, all the weaknesses. In a single night, the entire order was decimated. Or almost. Almost? Caleb looked at her across the flames, and there was something in his face that Nora still hadn't learned to interpret. Some escaped, few, very few. They hid in remote places, changed their names, buried their identities. Their existence proves that the lineage survived, at least partially. Nora absorbed the information in silence. Her mother, the woman who died in childbirth and about whom she knew so little, had been one of these survivors. A guardian hidden among the handmaidens, protecting her secret until the last moment. "Do you know who my mother was?" she asked, her voice small. "No," Caleb admitted, "but we can find out. There are hidden records, documents the Archons couldn't destroy. If we reach the mountain village, we can access them." The promise of answers was like a flame that warmed Nora from within, giving her strength to continue even when her body protested against the effort. She had never had roots, never known where she came from or to whom she belonged. The possibility of finally knowing her story was more precious than any treasure. On the 5th day of their journey, something changed. Nora awoke feeling the world differently, more sharply, as if a fog that had always been before her eyes had begun to dissipate. She could hear sounds that had previously escaped her, the rustling of a squirrel. In a distant tree, Caleb's heart beat across the camp, the murmur of a stream that should have been hundreds of yards away. "It's happening," Caleb said when she described the sensations. "Your wolf is approaching the surface." The idea should have frightened her, but instead, Nora felt a wave of euphoria course through her body. After a lifetime of being called defective, of believing there was something fundamentally wrong with her. The prospect of finally being complete was almost overwhelming. "What will it be like?" she asked. "When it fully awakens?" Caleb approached her, and Nora realized she could feel the warmth of his body even at that distance, an aura of energy that radiated from him like waves on water. "It will be intense," he said. "The first awakening always is. You will feel things you've never felt, perceive the world in completely new ways. And there will be the bond." The bond? He hesitated, something rare for someone who always seemed so sure of himself. When an alpha and a true omega are close during the awakening, a bond can form. A connection that goes beyond the physical or emotional. It's something even I don't fully understand. Nora felt her heart race, and she knew he could hear it. The idea of being connected to Caleb in such a deep way was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. She barely knew him, barely knew herself. How could she form such a significant bond? "Is it mandatory?" she asked. "The bond?" "No," Caleb replied, and there was something in his voice she couldn't identify. "It can be avoided, if both wish it. I would never force you into anything, Nora. You have my word." The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable, and Nora felt something within her relax. Despite all his strength, all his natural dominance, Caleb treated her as an equal. It was such a new experience that she barely knew how to process it. Days continued to pass, and with them, the changes in Nora intensified. Her vision became sharper, able to distinguish details at impossible distances. Her sense of smell developed a sensitivity that initially overwhelmed her, the world revealing itself in layers of sense that told stories she had never imagined existed. And there was something else, an awareness of Caleb that went beyond normal senses, as if a part of her was always attuned to his presence, even when she couldn't see him. On the 8th day, they found the first signs of pursuit. Caleb stopped abruptly in the middle of a clearing, his golden eyes sweeping the surrounding forest with renewed intensity. "Scouts," he said, his voice low. "About a day's journey away. There are many of them." Fear gripped Nora's heart, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do we do?" "There's a ravine not far from here. If we can cross it, we can gain an advantage. The terrain is treacherous, but we know the way. They don't. The walk to the ravine was made in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Nora felt the danger approaching like a pressure in her chest, a primal instinct screaming for her to run, to hide, to survive. But she refused to give in to panic. She had come too far to give up now. The ravine revealed itself as a scar on the landscape, a deep gorge carved into ancient rocks that rose in vertical walls on both sides. A narrow trail snaked along the edge, barely wide enough for one person at a time, with a dizzying drop into the void beside it. "Stay behind me," Caleb said, beginning the crossing with sure steps. "Don't look down." Nora obeyed, focusing on his back as she carefully placed one foot in front of the other. The trail was treacherous, with loose stones that threatened to give way with every step, and the wind blowing through the ravine seemed determined to snatch her from the edge. They were halfway across when the scream echoed behind them. Nora turned instinctively and saw figures emerging from the forest, soldiers in black armor she recognized as the Archon's elite guard, and at their head a grey-haired woman with eyes that burned with fury. Councilwoman Mildred had found them. "Don't stop!" Caleb shouted, grabbing Nora's hand and practically dragging her along the rest of the trail. Behind them, the soldiers hesitated before the narrow passage, but Mildred showed no such caution. "You can't escape, girl," the councilwoman's voice echoed through the ravine like the caw of a crow. "The council wants you alive, but I can assure you alive does not mean intact." Fear gave Nora strength she didn't know she possessed. She ran after Caleb, ignoring the void beside her, ignoring the stones that rolled under, her feet focusing only on surviving one more step, and another, and another. When they finally reached the other side of the ravine, Caleb turned and raised his hands. A wave of energy swept the trail behind them, and the stones began to crumble, creating an avalanche that sealed the passage in a cloud of dust and rock. Mildred's shouts of fury were muffled by the roar of the collapse, and then there was silence. Nora fell to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Caleb knelt beside her and she felt his hand on her shoulder, an anchor of warmth in a world that spun around her. "Are you okay?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. She looked at him, at those golden eyes that met hers with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life. And despite everything, despite the fear and exhaustion, she smiled. "I'm alive," she said. "That's more than I expected when I woke up this morning." Caleb returned the smile, and in that moment, Nora knew that no matter what lay ahead, she wouldn't be alone to face it. The rest of the day was spent in forced recovery. Caleb insisted they rest before continuing, and Nora, as much as she wanted to put as much distance as possible between them and Mildred, knew he was right. Her body was at its limit, muscles trembling with exhaustion, her mind clouded by days of constant tension. They found a shallow cave that offered some protection from the biting wind, and Caleb set up an improvised camp while Nora let herself fall onto a smooth rock, her back against the cave wall. "You saved my life back there," she said, watching him work. "If you hadn't brought down that passage, you would have found another way," Caleb replied without looking at her. "You are stronger than you imagine, Nora." It was strange to hear that. Her entire life, she had been defined by her weakness, her inadequacy, her inability to be what society demanded. And now this man, this alpha she had known for only days, spoke of her strength as if it were obvious. "Why do you believe in me so much?" she asked, curiosity overcoming hesitation. "You barely know me?" Caleb finally stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. There was something in his eyes she still couldn't decipher, a depth that suggested centuries of experience and emotion. "When I spent 1,000 years trapped in that sepulchre," he said, "the only thing that kept me sane was hope. The hope that one day someone would come. Someone who would be able to free me, not just physically, but in some deeper way. And then you appeared." Nora swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. "What if I'm not what you expected?" Caleb approached her and knelt before her, his golden eyes meeting hers, with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "You are already more than I could have expected," he said. "And this is just the beginning." The moment stretched between them, laden with unexpressed possibilities. Nora felt the warmth emanating from his body, an aura of power and protection that made her want to draw closer, to lose herself in that feeling of security she had never known. But the moment was broken by a distant sound, the caw of a crow that echoed through the surrounding rocks. Caleb stood up immediately, his senses alert, his body tense and ready for action. "Just a bird," he said after a moment, visibly relaxing. "But we should rest while we can. Tomorrow will be a long day." Nora nodded, making herself as comfortable as she could in the uncomfortable cave. She watched as Caleb took position at the entrance, his eyes sweeping the landscape beyond, a tireless guardian who needed no sleep. And as exhaustion finally overtook her, leading her into a dreamless sleep, the last thing she saw was his silhouette outlined against the starry sky, an image that etched itself into her memory as a promise of protection. The blocked. Ravine had bought them time but not safety. Caleb explained that the Archons knew other routes, longer paths that would eventually lead them to the same destination. They needed to keep moving, to exploit every moment of advantage, to get closer to the mountains where they would find haven. Nora felt her body changing with each passing day. What had begun as subtle alterations in her senses had transformed into something deeper, more visceral. There were moments when she felt a presence within her, a separate consciousness that observed the world through her eyes with a primitive curiosity. It Was her wolf, she knew, drawing ever closer to the surface. "You're stronger," Caleb observed one morning as they rested by a clear water lake. "I can feel the change in you." "It's strange," Nora admitted, dipping her hands into the cold water. "I spent my whole life feeling weak, incomplete. Now sometimes I want to run until I can't anymore, to scream, to let go in a way I've never allowed myself before." "That's the wolf," he said. "He's eager to emerge, to know the world that was denied to both of you for so long." She looked at him, through her reflection in the water, seeing the distorted image of his strong face, of the golden eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "What was it like for you? Your awakening?" Caleb fell silent for a moment, his gaze lost in some distant point of the past. "It was violent," he finally said. "I was young and my wolf was too powerful for a body that wasn't yet prepared. It almost destroyed me before we learned to coexist." "But you learned." "Yes, with time, with patience, and with the help of people who are no longer here." The sea, sadness in his voice, was palpable, and Nora felt the urge to comfort him, to touch his arm, his face, anything to alleviate the pain he clearly carried. But she held back, uncertain of how such a gesture would be received. "Do you miss them?" she asked instead. "The people you lost?" "Every day," Caleb replied, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "But the pain lessens with time. It doesn't disappear, it just becomes bearable. And now, for the first time in 1,000 years, I feel like I have something to fight for again." The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly present. Nora felt her heart quicken, and this time she didn't try to hide the reaction. She was tired of hiding, of repressing, of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. "Caleb," she said, and the name came out like a caress. "I don't know what's happening between us. I don't know if it's the bond you mentioned, or something more, or just extreme circumstances bringing us closer. But I know that since I met you, I feel more alive than in all my previous years combined." He extended his hand and touched her face, his warrior-rough fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "I feel it too," he said, "but I don't want you to confuse gratitude with something more. You were trapped, and I freed you. It's natural to feel some connection because of that." "It's not gratitude," she insisted, covering his hand with hers. "It's something more, something I have no words to describe." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, and Nora could have sworn she saw a battle happening behind his eyelids, an internal conflict between desire and duty, between what he wanted and what he thought was right. "When your wolf fully awakens," he finally said, opening his eyes, "you will be sure of what you feel. Until then, we need to be careful. The bond, once formed, cannot be undone. It is forever." Forever. The word echoed in Nora's mind like a bell, laden with weight and promise. It was a lot to contemplate, especially in the midst of a desperate escape, with enemies on their heels and an uncertain future ahead. But something within her, perhaps the awakening wolf, perhaps just her own stubborn heart, insisted there was nothing to fear. They continued their journey in a silence that was different from the previous ones, charged with unexpressed possibilities and feelings on the verge of overflowing. The surrounding landscape gradually changed, the dense forests giving way to more rugged terrain, hills that rose into rocky formations pointing to the sky like petrified giants' fingers. On the 12th day of their journey, they sighted the mountains. They rose on the horizon like a natural wall, snow-capped peaks gleaming under the sun like white jewels. Nora felt a wave of relief course through her body. They were almost there. "The village is in a valley between the two largest peaks," Caleb explained, pointing to a specific spot in the mountain range. "There's a hidden path few know. If we can reach it before the Archons find us, we'll be safe." "If," Nora repeated, and the word carried the weight of all the uncertainty they felt. Caleb looked at her, and there was determination on his face. "We will make it. We haven't come through all this to fail now." The ascent began that same afternoon. The terrain was steep and treacherous, with loose stones that rolled under their feet and biting winds that threatened to knock them down with every step. Nora discovered muscles she didn't know she possessed as she forced herself to continue, her legs burning, her lungs fighting for air in the rarefied atmosphere. But she wasn't alone. Caleb remained by her side, offering a hand when she stumbled, encouraging her with words and glances when her resolve faltered. And gradually, something changed between them. The cautious formality of the first days gave way to a nascent intimacy, small gestures and glances that spoke louder than words. On their second night in the mountains, sheltered, in a cave that protected them from the biting wind, Nora awoke trembling with cold. The fire they had lit had died out, and the temperature had dropped to levels her body couldn't endure. She tried to huddle under the furs Caleb had provided, but the shivering wouldn't stop. And then she felt him. Caleb lay beside her, enveloping her in his arms, the warmth of his body radiating like a furnace. Nora stiffened for an instant, surprised, but the sensation was too good to resist. She relaxed against him, her back against his broad chest, his strong arms around her waist. "Sleep," he whispered, his deep voice close to her ear. "I've got you." And she slept, more deeply than on any night since leaving the citadel. She awoke to the morning sun filtering through the cave's opening, and Caleb still held her, as if he hadn't moved all night. She turned in his arms, finding his golden eyes already open, watching her with an expression that made her forget how to breathe. "Good morning," he said, and there was a softness in his voice she had never heard before. "Good morning," she replied, and made no move to pull away. They stayed like that for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, and Nora felt something within her solidify, a certainty that transcended logic or reason. Whatever was happening between them, it was real. It was true. And she was willing to discover where it would lead them. But the moment was interrupted by a distant sound, voices echoing through the rocks. Caleb rose in a fluid movement, his senses alert, his eyes sweeping the landscape beyond the cave. "They found us," he said, and there was urgency in his voice. "We need to run." Nora rose, her heart pounding, the morning cold forgotten in the face of imminent danger. She followed Caleb out of the cave and into the rugged terrain above, running as she had never run before, her lungs burning, her legs protesting, but refusing to stop. The village was near, freedom was near, and she wouldn't let anything or anyone stop her from reaching it. The terrain became increasingly steep, but Nora discovered reserves of energy she didn't know she possessed. Her wolf stirred within her, pushing her forward, infusing her muscles with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical body. Caleb ran beside her, his strides long and sure, his eyes constantly checking the path ahead and the pursuers behind. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a crack in the rock that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The entrance to the hidden path. They squeezed through the narrow opening, and Nora felt the cold stone scraping her back as she advanced into the darkness. The tunnel gradually widened, revealing itself as an artificial passage carved into the rock by hands that understood their craft. "The ancients built this?" she asked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "The Guardians," Caleb confirmed. "They prepared havens like this throughout the realm, safe places for when the Order fell. They never imagined it would be so necessary." The irony was not lost on Nora. The Guardians had prepared everything, foreseen almost everything except the betrayal of those they swore to protect. It was a lesson she would carry in her heart, a reminder that trust, however necessary, should always be accompanied by caution. The tunnel snaked through the mountain, ascending and descending in a pattern that seemed deliberately confusing. Torches lit up automatically as they advanced, responding to their presence with an ancient magic Nora was beginning to recognize. It was the same energy she had felt in the seal, the same ancestral technology the Archons had tried to destroy. "We're almost there," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like hope. When they finally emerged on the other side, Nora gasped at the sight that unfolded before her. The valley stretched before them like a promise of hope, an oasis of green nestled between snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the very sky. Stone houses dotted the landscape, smoke, rising from chimneys creating lazy spirals against the infinite blue, and cultivated fields drew geometric patterns of varying shades of green and gold. It was more beautiful than anything Nora had ever seen, more beautiful than she had imagined possible. "It's real," she whispered, more to herself than to Caleb. He placed his hand on her shoulder, the touch conveying a security she still needed. "It's real," he confirmed. "And it's safe. At least for now." The descent into the valley was made in contemplative silence. Nora absorbed every detail around her, the sounds of birds that were different from those she knew, the scent of wildflowers growing among the rocks, the feeling of the sun warming her back after days of cold in the mountains. As they approached the first building, people began to appear, men and women of all ages who interrupted their tasks to observe the newcomers. Nora felt exposed under so many gazes, but there was no hostility in them, only curiosity and, in some cases, something that seemed like recognition. It was then that the grey-haired man appeared, running toward them with a speed that defied his aged appearance. The valley stretched before them like a dream come true, a pocket of green and life hidden among peaks of eternal snow. Stone houses dotted the landscape, smoke rising from chimneys, and in the centre of it all, a larger building that seemed to serve as the community's gathering place. People moved among the buildings, some stopping to look at the newcomers with expressions that mixed surprise and caution. "Caleb?" A man's voice cut through the air, laden with disbelief. Nora turned to see a grey-haired man approaching, his steps quickening until they became a run. He stopped before Caleb, his eyes wide, his hands trembling, as he touched the Alpha's shoulders as if he needed to confirm that he was real. "You're alive," the man said, and there were tears in his eyes. "After 1,000 years, you're alive." "Arthur," Caleb responded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You're still here." "Where else would I be?" The man laughed, but it was a wet laugh, laden with relief. "Someone had to keep the hope that you would return." The two embraced, and Nora watched in silence, feeling like an intruder in such an intimate moment. But then Arthur pulled away from Caleb and turned his attention to her, and there was something in his gaze that made her straighten her posture. "A guardian," he said, not as a question but as a confirmation. "I can feel the blood. How is it possible?" "The lineage survived," Caleb said. "Hidden, dormant, but it survived. Nora is living proof of it." Arthur approached her, and Nora resisted the urge to recoil. He examined her with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface, penetrating layers she herself didn't know. "Remarkable," he finally said. "The wolf is almost at the surface. In days, perhaps hours, she will be complete." "That's why we need help," Caleb said. "The awakening is coming, and she has no one to guide her but me." Arthur nodded, his face becoming serious. "We will take care of her. There are others here who can help. Omegas, who have gone through the awakening under difficult circumstances. She won't be alone." The words brought Nora a relief she hadn't known she needed. Since leaving the citadel, she had carried the weight of the unknown on her shoulders, the uncertainty of a future that seemed to rewrite itself with every moment. Knowing there were others, people who understood what she was going through, was invaluable comfort. The days that followed were the most intense of Nora's life. The village, which she discovered was called Haven, was more than a simple community of survivors. It was a repository of knowledge, a place where ancient traditions had been preserved while the rest of the realm forgot them. She was introduced to Omega women who shared their own awakening stories, some peaceful, others traumatic, all transformative. One of them, a woman with amber eyes named Maya, became her main guide. "The wolf is part of you," she explained in one of their sessions. "It is not a separate entity that needs to be tamed, but an extension of your own essence. When it emerges, you will be one, not two." "But how will I know when it happens?" Nora asked, the anxiety evident in her voice. "You'll know," Maya replied with a gentle smile. "It's like asking how you'll know when you fall in love. You just will." The mention of love made Nora think of Caleb, and Maya noticed the change in her expression. "The Alpha King," she said without judgment. "You feel something for him." It wasn't a question, and Nora didn't try to deny it. "Yes," she admitted, "but I don't know if it's real, if it's the bond, or the situation, or something more." Maya reached for her hand and held it firmly. "The bond doesn't create feelings where none existed. It amplifies what's already there. If you feel something for him now, before your wolf fully awakens, it's because that something is genuine." Maya's words echoed in Nora's mind in the days that followed. She continued to see Caleb regularly, at shared meals and brief encounters between their respective duties. He was busy with Arthur, discussing strategies, and making plans Nora wasn't included in, but which she suspected involved the future of the realm as a whole. On the fifth night in Haven, Nora awoke with a sensation unlike any before. There was an urgency in her body, an energy that pulsed beneath her skin like electricity. The wolf, she realized with sudden clarity, was ready to emerge. She rose from the bed she was sleeping in, her movements almost automatic, guided by an instinct that transcended conscious thought. She left the cabin where she was lodged and walked through the sleeping village until she reached a clearing that overlooked the entire valley. The full moon shone in the sky, bathing everything in a silvery light that seemed to pulse in sync with her heart. And then she felt him. Caleb was there, emerging from the shadows as if he had been summoned by the same force that had drawn her. His golden eyes gleamed in the moonlight, and there was a tension in his body that mirrored hers. "It's happening," he said, not as a question. "Yes," she replied, and her voice sounded different in her own ears. Deeper, wilder. He approached her in slow, measured steps, as if afraid to startle her. "Are you sure you want to do this here? With me?" Nora looked at him, at the man who had entered her life like an earthquake and turned it upside down. The man who had saved her, who had protected her, who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And she knew with a certainty that transcended any doubt what she wanted. "Yes," she said. "Here, with you." Caleb closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. "What is about to happen will change everything," he said. "Once the bond forms, there's no turning back. You will be mine, and I will be yours, forever." "I know," she replied, covering his hands with hers, "and it's exactly what I want." The kiss that followed was like liquid fire, an explosion of sensations that coursed through Nora's body from head to toe. And as their lips met, as their hands explored each other with increasing urgency, she felt the wolf finally break through the surface. The transformation was intense, overwhelming, and at the same time, perfectly natural. It was as if a part of her that had always existed but had remained dormant finally opened its eyes and saw the world for the first time. She could feel everything, hear everything, perceive everything with a clarity that bordered on the supernatural. And through it all, there was Caleb. His presence was an anchor, a fixed point in a sea of chaotic sensations. The bond formed between them like threads of light, connecting them in ways words couldn't describe. When she finally emerged from the other side of the experience, Nora was a different person. Not better or worse, just complete in a way she never had been before. And beside her, holding her in his arms, was Caleb, his golden eyes shining with an emotion she could now feel as clearly as her own. "Welcome back," he said, his voice soft with reverence. And Nora smiled because for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. The days that followed the awakening were filled with adaptation and discovery. Nora learned to navigate her new senses, to control the strength that now coursed through her veins, to hear the voice of the wolf within her, without losing herself in it. Maya and the other Omegas were patient, guiding her through each obstacle with wisdom born of their own experience. But what surprised her most was the bond with Caleb. It was a connection that transcended the physical, a tie that allowed her to feel his emotions as if they were her own. When he was happy, she felt a warmth in her chest. When he was worried, a tension settled in her mind. It was invasive and intimate and absolutely wonderful. "Do you regret it?" Caleb asked one night as they watched the stars from the top of a cliff overlooking the valley. Nora looked at him, at his strong profile illuminated by the moonlight, and felt a wave of affection so intense it almost brought her to her knees. "Not for a second," she said. "You?" He turned to face her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart race every time she saw it. "How could I regret the best thing that has happened to me in 1,000 years?" She laughed, a light, free laugh that still surprised her every time it escaped her lips. The defective handmaiden who had been raised to hide and diminish herself was slowly dying, replaced by someone Nora was beginning to enjoy getting to know. "Arthur said we need to start making plans," Caleb continued, his tone becoming more serious. "The Archons won't give up searching for us. And now that you've awakened, the guardian blood in you has become even more valuable to them. The reminder that there were still dangers out there, enemies who wanted them dead or captured, was like cold water on a hot day." Nora felt the wolf stir within her, a protective instinct surging with an intensity that still surprised her. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Caleb took her hands in his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel seen to her soul. "We will fight," he said, "not with swords and violence, but with truth. We will show the realm what the Archons truly are, what they did, the lies upon which they built their power. And you think people will believe? Some will, others won't. But if we can plant the seed of doubt, if we can make them question the history they've been told, we will have taken the first step toward change." It was an ambitious plan, almost impossible, but looking into Caleb's eyes, feeling the determination that flowed through their bond, Nora believed they could succeed. "Together," she said, squeezing his hands. "Together," he confirmed. And under the blanket of stars they sealed a new pact, not just of love, but of purpose. What the Archons began 1,000 years ago they would finish, not with destruction, but with rebuilding, not with hatred, but with justice. The real battle was just beginning. The weeks in Haven passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Nora discovered a talent for diplomacy she never imagined she possessed, mediating disputes between suspicious factions and building bridges where before there had only been chasms. Caleb was her pillar of strength, her advisor and partner in all things, and together they navigated the turbulent waters of a realm in transition. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when Nora wondered if they were making a difference, if the changes they were implementing were enough, if they would live to see the world they dreamed of building. But then Caleb held her in his arms, and the bond between them pulsed with a certainty that transcended words. And she knew they were on the right path. The first generation of children to learn the true history was born a year after the agreement. Nora visited the newly opened schools, where carefully selected teachers taught about the Guardians, about the true Alphas, about a past that had been hidden for 1,000 years. The children's curious eyes, their endless questions, their open minds were proof that seeds were being planted. "You're crying again," Caleb observed during one of these visits, a gentle smile on his lips. "They're tears of happiness," she replied, wiping her eyes. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real." He took her hand and kissed it gently. "It is real," he said. "You made it real." Nora shook her head. "We made it real. Together." And it was true. Neither of them could have succeeded alone. It was the union of their strengths, their talents, their hearts that had made the impossible possible. When spring arrived, bringing flowers to the Citadel gardens that Nora now called home, she knew a new phase of their lives was about to begin. The wolf within her stirred in a different way. A new life growing in her womb, a living symbol of everything they had fought for. Caleb was speechless with emotion when she told him, his golden eyes gleaming with tears he rarely allowed to fall. "A child," he said, his voice hoarse. "Our child." "Or daughter," Nora corrected with a smile. "We don't know yet." He pulled her into an embrace so tight she almost couldn't breathe, but she didn't complain. The love that flowed through their bond was overwhelming in its intensity. "I will protect both of you with my life," he vowed. Nora pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "I know you will," she said. "But I also know you won't need to. Because we're no longer running, Caleb. We're no longer fighting to survive. We're building. And what we're building will last." He nodded, and there was a peace on his face she rarely saw. The war was ending, slowly but inexorably. And in its place, something new, something better, was emerging. And so, the story of Nora, the Omega who was called defective, the guardian who awakened a king and a realm, continued. Not as a perfect fairy tale, but as real life, with its ups and downs, its victories and defeats, its moments of doubt and its instants of pure happiness. She looked out the window of her chambers, at the city that spread beyond the citadel walls, at the mountains in the distance where havens still sheltered those who needed refuge. And she smiled. The past had been rewritten. The present was being lived. And the future, for the first time in 1,000 years, belonged to everyone.